Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 16, The Battle of Lodz. On the morning of November 8, General von Falkenhayn, in his new headquarters at Mézières, consulted the chief of the field railways upon the transport of important forces from the western to the eastern front. Colonel Gröner informed him that it was possible to transport upon the 4 double tracks across Germany 4 army corps simultaneously. Each corps would require 40 trains daily and would arrive at its destination 4.5 days later. The corps would have to be drawn 2 from the right wing, 1 from the center, and 1 from the left of the fighting front. In case of necessity, he could even transport a 5th in the single sweep. But no doubt it would not be possible to withdraw so many units simultaneously from the line. The whole railway operation could be repeated in cycles as often as was desired. There was certainly the gravest need for reinforcing the eastern theatre. The repulse of the German army from Warsaw could only be the prelude of a Russian onslaught on the largest scale. The Austrians were in the depth of dejection and disorganization, and Conrad was unceasing in his reproaches for lack of help and even for breach of faith. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had done wonders with their limited forces and would still strike many a shrewd, fierce blow. But the odds against them seemed overwhelming. From the 3rd week in October, when the retreat in South Poland was known to Supreme Headquarters, Falkenhayn had been left in no doubt of their need, and he felt it acutely. But meanwhile he was himself deeply involved in the endless battle of the Isar. He had curtailed his ambitions till they now flew no higher than the capture of Ypres. This would not be a strategical or even a tactical gain. It might indeed even be more advantageous to leave that shell trap in enemy hands. But some definite, indisputable event was required before the disastrous attempt against the Channel ports could be broken off. The capture of Ypres and the descent of winter would afford an indispensable pretext for closing down in the west. Ypres then it must be. And thereafter Gröner's trains could carry at least 4 army corps to sustain and indeed restore the balance in the east. But Ypres was stubborn. Haig and the 1st British Army Corps, long bombarded and tormented, held every point with constancy. The 4 new German corps, with their youthful volunteers, had broken themselves in vain upon what seemed to be an inexpugnable defense. The German chief could not know how thin was the unyielding line of rifles, or how straitened their store of shells. Very nearly at Geloweld, on October 31, had Falkenhayn gained the consolation prize. On that afternoon, when for a time his front was actually broken, Sir Douglas Haig, there being no troops to send, had found it necessary to mount his horse and ride with half a dozen officers and his flag slowly forward amid the shells along the Menin road. On that or a similar day, the survivors of a German company, penetrating a gap occupied only by the dead, had found themselves some distance inside the British front. They heard the battle going on behind them and conceived themselves in the midst of the hostile army. Their officer, forlorn, looked for some authority to whom to surrender. Eventually he laid down his arms to a sergeant and some hurriedly armed cooks. And as the prisoners proceeded to the rear, he asked, "But where is your army? Where are your reserves?" His captors were too few to afford to tell him the truth. But all Falkenhayn knew was that the young corps had been bloodily stopped. Now the best troops must be employed. A fresh army corps, containing a division of the Prussian Guard, was to make the decisive assault on the 10th, eventually the 11th, as a part of the final offensive in which 22 divisions would march. That would finish with Ypres and then eastward ho! So on this 8th day of November, having heard the report of his railway director, he dispatched a trusted agent from Mézières to the Austro-Hungarian headquarters at Krakow with an important message for Konrad. We have heard of this agent before. He is the same Colonel Hensch whose journey along the German line on September 9 had produced the general retirement which signaled the immortal end of the Marne. Here is the proof that Hensch had not exceeded his authority on that occasion. We find him again at the vital center of affairs, charged with the most delicate and responsible duties. But this time his orders are in writing. Proceed at once to the Austro-Hungarian headquarters and report the following by word of mouth to General Konrad von Hötzendorf. I deeply regret that the whole course of our offensive in the west has only permitted me to send 3 cavalry divisions and 40,000 troops as reinforcements to the east. Any further weakening in the west would react very unfavorably on our condition without bringing about a decision in the east. Nevertheless, I hope in about a fortnight to make 5 or 6 army corps available for the east. They must naturally be employed in the most effective direction, that is, along the Vistula in cooperation with strong detachments of the German 8th and 9th armies. The first condition for the success of this operation is that the Austro-Hungarian army, together with the German forces fighting at its side, must hold the Russian armies on the left bank of the Vistula and draw more forces towards it. Colonel Hensch arrived at Konrad's headquarters on the afternoon of November 10. What he said was recorded. General von Falkenhayn knows well how important it is to obtain a decision in Russia, but the whole German army is spread out from the Vosges to the coast, 100 to 200 yards from the enemy. The Germans want Ostend in order to make a war harbor there for U-boats. It is therefore important for the Supreme Command to drive the Allies back to Dunkirk. The Belgians have made inundations, as a result of which the 3rd Reserve Corps had to retire. We wish to take Ypres. If we do that, the English and French must go back. If the attack does not have the desired success, General von Falkenhayn will relieve certain forces and send them to the east. In this case, Germany would be leaving France the initiative. The German forces must therefore be grouped in depth, and the armies must have reserves behind them, in order to prevent a breakthrough. The taking up of this formation in depth requires time. General von Falkenhayn hopes to be able to send 5 or 6 corps at latest in a fortnight. He thinks, moreover, that the 8th Army, which has already parted with 2 corps, might give up some more, even at the cost of leaving East Prussia open. He hopes that the operations starting from the direction of Thorn with 12 Prussian army corps may bring about a decision. Konrad asked when the German corps could be in the east. Hensch replied, "That would be about November 22. We can detrain 4 corps simultaneously." Konrad then said that the date of the advance of the German 9th Army was already fixed for November 11. The question was whether this offensive should be carried out or whether it should wait until the German reinforcements arrived. Hensch replied that his chief was still without knowledge of the offensive planned by the High Command East, that is Hindenburg and Ludendorff. But the Supreme Headquarters had thought of engaging 5 or 6 extra corps in the neighborhood of Thorn in order to throw back the Russians towards the southeast by pressure from the north. It must be, he opined, the same operation which the 9th Army now wanted to make alone with 13 or 14 divisions. In these circumstances, he could only inform General Ludendorff that in about a fortnight 5 or 6 corps would arrive with reinforcements, and leave it to him entirely whether to wait for them or not. The conversation shows either that Falkenhayn had not informed Hensch of the already decided and about to start maneuver, or that Hindenburg and Ludendorff had kept their secrets to themselves. It shows also that once again Hensch had been sent on a mission the wrong way round. In September he should have visited Klug before Bülow. In November he should have seen Hindenburg before Conrad. On November 9, Hindenburg and Ludendorff begged the Supreme Command for reinforcements to carry out their new offensive. Hensch was told to return via Hindenburg's headquarters and discuss the situation. Falkenhayn replied on the same evening, "I hope in a fortnight to make 4 more active corps available in the east. In the meantime," he added inconsequently, "any partial successes possible would be of great value." Hindenburg and Ludendorff had now to decide whether they would march unaided the next morning or wait a fortnight for a far more decisive operation with the promised reinforcements. The question was nicely balanced. Falkenhayn's telegram clearly placed the burden of decision on them. It must have been tempting to wait for the extra corps. But the time they arrived, the Russians would have completely filled the bulge in the Polish salient and would probably already have penetrated some distance into Silesia. Any inertia by the Ninth Army would only encourage the Grand Duke in feeling that the Germans had been decisively beaten in the east. The whole impulse of the Russian army would be to press forward on to hostile soil. And in this mood they might well forget or put in the shade the perils they would run by a German counterstroke from the northern bastion. All the weight of the argument was in favor of delay till the enemy was more deeply involved and the strength of the German forces had doubled. But supposing they waited for the fortnight and the 4 corps did not arrive or only arrived piecemeal, then the inroad of the Russians would have become most serious. They would have established themselves in positions protecting their right flank. They would perhaps have interrupted some of the railways between Posen and Krakow. The danger would be all the greater, and possibly the means of coping with it might be practically unimproved. Anyhow, Hindenburg and Ludendorff had timed their new offensive to start at daybreak. They decided to pursue unsupported their original plan. Events were to prove that they were wise to do so. The final assault of the campaign of 1914 in the west took place on November 11. The Germans attacked the whole front from Bethune to the sea. The main force of the attack was concentrated upon the 3 sides of the Ypres salient. 22 divisions converged upon the Ypres salient from Bischote to Freilingen, supported by the greatest artillery fire yet heard. The Prussian Guard headed the onfall astride of the Menin road. Side by side 12 Allied divisions, 7 British and 5 French, intermingled at many points, withstood the shock. Night fell upon severe losses, but with the line virtually intact. This battle produced a change in Falkenhayn's outlook. He was forced to recognize that his campaign in the west must now end, and end in failure. His reaction, however, was no longer to send as many troops as possible to the east. On the contrary, he seems to have been apprehensive of his own weakness on the western front. His reports to the Kaiser at this time show that he regarded the German army as having sustained at least a moral defeat of the first order. It was the duty of General von Plessen to summarize Falkenhayn's reports daily for the Kaiser. He has recorded his own impressions in his diary. On November 14, His Majesty is in a very depressed mood, is of the opinion that the attack on Ypres has failed and come to grief, and with it the campaign. At any rate, the report of General von Falkenhayn that there are only 6 days' ammunition left, which means that today there are only 4 days left, is absolutely overwhelming. If we leave this place without a decision in our favor, it is a moral defeat of the first class, a very bad situation which will be made worse by our recent heavy losses. November 16. The Imperial Chancellor called me up. He is concerned about the enormous loss at Ypres, wishes me to use my influence to stop further attempts to break through the position by main force. I am of the same opinion. Falkenhayn, however, will not abandon the attack on Ypres until the last heavy shell has been fired. Then 4 or 5 corps will be sent to the east. But Hindenburg and Ludendorff, now at grips, requested precise dates for the arrival of the promised corps. Their telegram of November 14 and 18 compelled Falkenhayn to come to a clear decision. On November 18 he wrote to Hindenburg a letter pregnant with consequences, revealing the change in his views. After rehearsing the reinforcements he had already sent, he said that the decision to send forces from west to east would be made easier if there was a well-founded hope that the arrival of fresh forces would, as far as could be foreseen, bring about a final decision in the east. At present this hope seemed to have no foundation. In the most favorable circumstances the enemy might be drawn back behind the Narew and Vistula line and compelled to evacuate Galicia. This, although of great political importance, would not be decisive. It would be of no value whatever if, in the meantime, their western enemies succeeded in driving the German forces back, or even in compelling them to give up the coast. For our most dangerous enemy is not in the east, but England, with whom her conspiracy against Germany stands and falls. We can only injure her if we maintain our contact with the sea. Similarly, Germany could only hold France in check if she maintained her present position in the west. The injurious influence of even the smallest revival of French hopes had been shown after the German retirement in September, which was in the main ascribed to the weakening of the Western Army in favor of the East. The Chief of the Staff concluded with the assertion that the Supreme Command had decided, in spite of the above objections, to bring forces from the west, but they could not be sent simultaneously and must arrive one after the other. Such was the reaction upon the eastern front of the successful defense of Ypres. These second thoughts found Hindenburg and Ludendorff in the heart of a desperate battle. The indefatigable German corps opened their offensive in North Poland on November 10. Mackensen, whose conduct in the South Poland battles had retrieved any laurels lacking at Gumbinnen, was now placed in command of the whole Ninth Army. He advanced with his left hand on the Vistula, as if it were a balustrade. The impingement of the front was oblique, and the Russians, whose units of the Second and Fifth Armies were streaming forward towards Silesia, suddenly found their right shoulders violently assaulted from the direction of Thorn. In 3 days Mackensen captured over 12,000 prisoners and threw back, in much disorder, the Russian right, whose divisions and even brigades were encountered in detail by the German advance from this unexpected quarter. On the 15th and 16th, the 5th Siberian, 7th Siberian and 2nd Corps of the First Army were all engaged and lost heavily, leaving, according to the German claim, 25,000 prisoners in the enemy's hands. All these defeated troops fell back on and towards Lodz. Around this Cotonopolis of Central Europe, a battle of extraordinary complication now impended. The Grand Duke disposed of numbers so superior that the Germans found themselves matched and baffled by the enormous masses directed and maneuvered. Though with primitive mechanical efficiency, by a headquarters brain whose knowledge of the military art was not surpassed in Europe. We shall now descend from the movements of armies and the sphere of strategy to a more detailed view of this remarkable battle. The unexpected rapidity of Hindenburg and Ludendorff's advance brought their main forces into contact with the Second Russian Army during November 15. The 1st Reserve Corps and the Cavalry Division pierced the front of this army, as a swimmer might strike out with a breaststroke. The other 4 corps, namely the 9th, 17th, 20th, and 25th Reserve, swinging to the right, were by the evening of the 16th of November facing almost south towards Lodz. Here was the real breakthrough, so long to be sought for on the Western Front. The front of the enemy is broken, the flanks are exposed on each side of the gap, while the intruding force prepares to rip and roll up the whole of the front. Or the 17th and 18th of November the Germans marched and fought in both directions, and two struggles developed on each side of the gap. With the northerly and lesser we need not much concern ourselves. The crisis was fought to the southward. By the end of November 18 the Germans had encircled Lodz, and perhaps 150,000 Russians defending it on three sides. They were hopefully preparing to close their net, within which there struggled at least 4 Russian corps. The whole of these troops were, on the night of November 18, confined in an area about 16 miles long by 8 broad. Their destruction seemed imminent. It looked to General Knox as if Sedan and Tannenberg were to be repeated. But meanwhile, amid the confusion of these unforeseeable events, and in spite of being continually beaten in each locality by much smaller numbers of Germans, the brain of the Russian High Command continued to function clearly and resolutely. The Grand Duke, on the night of November 17, while the climax was still impending, ordered the whole of the Fifth Army, which stood in the Russian line to the southward, to face about, countermarch and rescue the Second Army by driving back the left of the encircling Germans. The Fifth Army therefore marched northeastward during the whole of November 19 and 20. They traversed the only unenclosed side of the oblong space in which the Second Army was imprisoned. During the 21st they came into heavy action with the German 25th Reserve Corps, which formed the extreme point of the encircling movement. The Germans stood with their backs to Russia, and the Russians with their backs to Germany. On this day, if a spectator had received a safe conduct to travel from north to south across the armies, he would in a journey of 25 miles have passed through 8 separate fighting lines, back to back or face to face. Military authorities have pithily likened the situation to a Neapolitan ice. On the 19th of November, the Stavka heard from the Second Army that its right wing was completely enveloped and the enemy in possession of several localities southwest of Lodz. The Second Army was on the defensive in every direction, and all its reserves had been thrown in. Thereafter all communication failed. The silence which enwrapped the Stavka left them the prey to terrible forebodings. At the same time that the Grand Duke had ordered the Fifth Army to countermarch, General Ruzsky, who commanded the northwest front, had detached 3.5 divisions from the left of his First Army to march south upon the backs of the Germans encircling the Second Army. This force, known as the Lovich Force, moved tardily and disjointedly. Its commander was changed the same evening that it started, and changed again next day. Nevertheless, by the afternoon of November 21, its leading division, the 6th Siberian, began to press upon the rear of the 25th Reserve Corps, at the same time that large masses of the Russian Fifth Army were attacking them from the opposite quarter. The position of the 25th Reserve Corps and the 3rd Guard Division seemed now to be as fatally compromised as the Russian Second Army around Lodz had been on the night of November 18. General Schäfer, who commanded, found that instead of enveloping and encircling the Russian masses in Lodz, he was himself surrounded, and in the midst of enemies. The audacious German turning movement was not only attacked by superior forces in its front, but it was cut off from the rest of the Ninth Army and attacked in the rear by 4 Russian divisions, who barred every avenue of retreat. The tables were thus completely turned. The stakes for which the Germans had played were the highest known in war. They had not succeeded, and when darkness fell on November 21, it looked as if the grim forfeit would be exacted. It was in these conditions that Schäfer and his 3 German divisions fought on all fronts, facing in every direction, during the whole of the 22nd of November. We do not know what reports, if any, he was able to send to his superiors, but at any rate the army commander Mackensen and presumably Hindenburg and Ludendorff realized that all chance of netting the Russians in Lodz had failed. Tannenberg would not be repeated there. At 7 o'clock in the evening, orders reached Schäfer to retire by the best route possible. A glance at the map will show that Schäfer's 60,000 Germans were far more completely surrounded than Samsonov's army had been at Tannenberg. Moreover, they were surrounded by vastly superior numbers. So far as strategy can achieve or maps record a situation, their destruction seemed certain. In fact, trains to carry 20,000 prisoners were already ordered at the Warsaw Railway Center. But now one of those homely truths of war proclaimed itself. A sharp knife will cut wood. By daybreak on November 23, Schäfer's well-knit organization was marching due north against the Lodz force. On this date, he engaged the 6th Siberian Division. This division fought well all day. Its commander, seeing himself confronted with overwhelming German masses advancing upon him in 3 columns, cried out for help in all directions. Such was the confusion and failure of communications that he did not know that these German columns were themselves recoiling from the onset of the superior 5th Russian Army, which was following them up. The commander of the First Corps, says Knox, was implored to move, but he and his troops, having been badly hustled, had been cowed into passivity. They, or probably only he and his staff, lacked the reserve of moral stamina for renewed effort. He hesitated to pursue and, finally, decided to ask army commander. The latter did nothing. The 6th Siberian Division also called on the rest of the Lodz force to come to their assistance, but so predominant was the terror of the German armies at this time in the minds of Russian divisional and corps commanders that no effective measures were taken. Accordingly, on the 24th of November, Schäfer destroyed the 6th Siberian Division. That division, finding itself enfiladed in every direction and abandoned, retired during the morning of the 24th, and finding Germans already in Breziny, dispersed in every direction. Barely 1,500 Siberians escaped. Schäfer then marched northwest and resumed his station between the 1st Reserve and 20th Corps of the German 9th Army. His men had fought and marched continuously every day for at least 9 days. They had almost encircled a Russian army. Completely surrounded themselves by hordes of enemies, they had cut their way through, losing scarcely any guns or prisoners, and carrying with them, through the midst of these perils and maneuvers, nearly all their own wounded and 10,000 Russian captives. It should be added that the weather during this period was exceptionally severe. The temperature at night fell to within 10 degrees Fahrenheit of zero. According to Danilov, the front was becoming intensified with icy winds and with no prospect of snow and its accompanying rise in temperature. Thus ended the Battle of Lodz, in which 250,000 Germans were pitted against between 500,000 and 600,000 Russians, in which the Germans only just failed to surround and capture 150,000 Russians, and in which the Russians clutched, surrounded, but failed to hold 60,000 Germans. No exact information of the casualties is at present to hand, but certainly we shall not exaggerate if we say that the Germans had 35,000 killed and wounded, and the Russians at least double that number, with 25,000 prisoners taken in addition. Both sides shook themselves clear of this dreadful close. Breathless and exhausted, the Russians held Lodz until December 6, when they rearranged their line to the south of Warsaw. The Germans remained in close contact along their front and occupied Lodz in due course with further fighting. all hopes of a Russian advance into Silesia had been effectually frustrated. All the cabinets of the Allies had taken it for granted that Serbia would be destroyed in the Great War soon and easily by the might of Austria. However, when we left the Serbians in the last week of August, not a man of the imperial armies remained on Serbian soil. The Austrians had rushed in and had been flung out. They had wasted on the Drina and the Save the soldiers desperately needed in Galicia. There was a pause. Early in September, Putnik's First Army, raiding across the Save, maintained itself precariously for a week on Hungarian soil. Podgorek was able to drive them out, but his further efforts in September founded upon Serbian defensive tenacity. Whether he pressed with his Sixth Army across the Drina to threaten Putnik's left or tried to cut in behind his right, or when he attacked in the center, he was equally brought to a standstill, often in sodden, low-lying fields, always with grievous losses. Both armies, the Serbs had been fighting since 1912, were exhausted. Putnik, urged on by Russia to strike a further blow for the common cause, made by an excursion into southern Bosnia an alarming threat against the communications of the Austrian Sixth Army, with Sarajevo as his goal. It took Podgorek most of October to evict the raiders. But he could not drive them from Semlin, which they had entered at the end of September, nor, worst of all, could the Austrian troops cope with the trench warfare which had developed all along the front. By November, Bosnia was cleared of its Serbian invaders, and both sides prepared themselves for a final effort. The Serbs were encouraged chiefly by rumors. The Russians, even the Greeks, were coming to their aid. Some British sailors and naval guns had actually arrived. Putnik, however, inferior in artillery, short of munitions, disorganized, several-fold decimated, determined to quit the dangerous angle of the great rivers and retire upon Valjevo and Kolubara. The initiative passed to the Austrians. Podgorek's last chance had come. Using his unfading influence with the Emperor's circle, he scraped and scratched from Conrad's hard-pressed armies and from their joint munitions supply the means for a new offensive. He advanced on the familiar double pincers plan. By November 15, Valjevo, Putnik's headquarters in the Jadar battle, fell to the Austrian Sixth Army. The Serbians recoiled before the onset, and by the 22nd Podgorek's line was established across the Kolubara, and he had captured, with hard fighting and heavy casualties, 8,000 Serbian prisoners and 40 guns. Here at any rate was a success, or something which might be represented as such. Here, as the Austrian history tells us, he might well have paused. But Podgorek, though cautious of his person, was vigorous in thought. He saw the Serbs as a beaten enemy to be pursued. Belgrade lay near, and with it the longed-for railway, which opened to the Central Powers the road to Turkey. And above all, almost within his grasp, the nearer Obrenovac-Valjevo railway offered at last a new line of supply, a priceless relief to the present overtaxed and far-stretched communications running back behind the Drina. Despite deep snow in the mountains, rain below, appalling roads, shortage of food, and an army dispirited, almost in rags, divided in its loyalties, he pressed on. In the Battle of the Kolubara which followed, the Austrian armies drove forward another dozen miles. Putnik's leadership was not unworthy of his indomitable soldiers. Driven to the decision of a lifetime, he abandoned Belgrade. He swung back his right till it faced northwest. His left, the critical pivot, meant to hold fast at all costs, gave way under the pressure of the Austrian Sixth Army. But at the same time, when all seemed lost, the pursuing Austrians themselves subsided through sheer exhaustion, and from that moment the tide turned. Austrian troops might enter Belgrade. Podgorek, courtier-like, might announce its capture to the emperor as a greeting for his 84th birthday. But the Serbian nation, which was now its army, gathered itself for a supreme effort. Old King Peter, entering the trenches rifle in hand among his soldiers, appealed to his fierce countrymen. The Austrians were at the end of their tether. The Serbian counteroffensive began. On December 3, all their armies attacked. The first turned savagely on the Austrians in the hills. The third advanced in the center. The second in the north met Podgorek's expiring effort to lap around their weak right wing. Irresistibly, the northwest drive of the Serbian Second Army surged forward, threatening at once to cut off Podgorek's enveloping troops. On December 9, after nearly a week's confused but severe fighting, the outermost Austrian division was recalled. Said the telephone from headquarters, "All has been in vain. Make no more efforts. We must go back. The order follows." It was time. Podgorek's armies were cleft asunder. His Fifth Army was bunched up around Belgrade, and his Sixth, with the Serbians at their heels, was in full flight for Shabatz. By December 15, the Third Austrian assault upon Serbia had been flung back in utter rout across the river into the lands whence they came. The hated pig farmers of Serbia, for the sake of whose punishment almost the whole world had been plunged in war, had added to the Austrian annals this most ignominious, rankling and derisory defeat. It brought one advantage in its train. It was the end of Podgorek. The prodigy of the Serbian resistance was hardly comprehended by the busy world at war, but those who were best informed were the most astonished. It is necessary to mention here the fortunes of the Turkish armies that invaded the Caucasus in pursuance of the long-cherished plan of Young Turkey. Enver Pasha, assuming direct command, concentrated at Erzurum the three corps, the 9th, 10th, and 11th, stationed in peace in Armenia, reinforcing them with a division from Baghdad and bringing by sea from Constantinople the First Corps, 2 more divisions to Trebizond. The Turkish Third Army, so formed, comprised nearly 150,000 men, while on the Russian side Vorontsov, his forces depleted in order to swell the Galician armies, could muster but 100,000. Vorontsov had struck the first blow. In November he had thrust it across the frontier to Kopri-Keui, 30 miles short of Erzurum. Here he had been confronted by Enver's 11th Corps. But Enver's plan was developing. The Russian army at Sarikamish was wholly dependent upon the railway from Tiflis and Kars. Enver, with Colonel von Schellenberg as chief of the staff, aimed the usual German turning movement at this vital line of communication. Holding the Russians frontally, he sent the 9th and 10th Corps to turn their right and descend through the passes upon the Kars-Sarikamish railway. Meanwhile, much farther to the north, the Turkish First Corps drove down the Choruk Valley, whence they too were to close in on the Tiflis railway. This plan in such a country and at this season was foolhardy. The First Corps, in particular, had to cross at 8,000 feet in the depth of winter the snow-bound passes leading down to Ardahan. By the new year, the troops engaged in these desperate endeavors were in extremity. Struggling in snowdrifts through the rocky defiles, by which alone advance was possible, lashed by incessant blizzards in hideous privation, their columns were encountered each in turn by the Russians along the Sarikamish front. On New Year's Day, Yudenich, the local Russian commander, repelled the 10th Corps finally from his vital railway. The 9th, thus stripped of support, was enveloped and destroyed. Its commander and his staff surrendered. 50 miles to the northward, the First Corps persisted in its fantastically conceived mission. It actually succeeded in crossing the passes to Ardahan, to the amazement and alarm of the Russian headquarters. But there its effort died. A counterattack drove the frozen and gasping Turks back into the icy wastes through which they had descended. Only the 11th Corps, for a while, played its part. Around Kara-Urgan, in a gallant effort at least to cover the retreat of the remnants of the 9th and 10th, it made some headway, but by mid-January Judenich was able to concentrate against it. In a few days after heavy loss, it was forced to retreat to Erzurum, with the horrors of winter and famine added to military defeat. Thus, at length, this skillful and determined Russian defense achieved a victorious fulfillment. By the last days of January, the tables in this desperate game had been completely turned. Judenich, almost by standing still, aided by those elements the Turks had ignored, had robbed them of the reward of their wildly audacious maneuver and intense efforts. They perished in their attempt. Individuals escaped to tell the tale, but in the mountains above Sarikamish alone, the corpses of 30,000 frozen soldiers were discovered and counted by the Russian patrols. Thus the situation in the Caucasus, which at the close of the year had seemed almost forlorn, was within a fortnight decisively retrieved.